Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is a crime action from 2018 titled Death Wish. Late at night in the bustling city of Chicago, a police car races recklessly towards the hospital. Inside, one of the officers has been shot and is in critical condition. With urgency, the injured officer is swiftly taken into surgery, and the medical staff immediately contacts Paul, renowned as the hospital's finest surgeon. Paul, realizing the gravity of the situation, delegates his current task to another doctor and rushes to attend to the wounded officer. Tragically, his efforts prove futile and the officer dies. The following morning, Paul enjoys a peaceful breakfast with his wife Lucy and their daughter Jordan. The atmosphere lightens as they celebrate Jordan's acceptance to college in New York. They proceed to Jordan's soccer match, where Paul and Lucy shower their daughter with unwavering support. However, their joy is tainted by the presence of an angry father who won't stop yelling at the kids. Paul politely requests him to refrain from his outbursts. Enraged, the man responds aggressively, sparking a heated argument that quickly escalates, threatening to turn violent. Lucy intervenes and guides Paul away from the escalating confrontation, while the man insults Paul, labeling him a coward. After the game, the family meets with Paul's brother Frank at a pizza joint. In a show of generosity, Paul agrees to lend Frank $2,000, though Frank teasingly mocks Paul's salary. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation is inadvertently overheard by Miguel, the valet attendant. Miguel also discovers that the family will be away from home later that night, and when he retrieves their car, he sees their home address on the car's GPS system. In the evening, the family eagerly prepares to celebrate Paul's birthday, presenting him with a new watch. But their happiness is cut short when Paul gets an urgent call from the hospital and has no choice but to leave the party. As Paul reluctantly departs, Lucy and Jordan redirect their plans towards grocery shopping. Upon returning home, they notice a suspicious van lurking nearby. Jordan retreats upstairs to make a phone call while Lucy busily prepares a cake for Paul, unaware of the presence hiding behind a door. Suddenly, Lucy's attention is drawn to her cookbook as a gust of wind sweeps through the window she thought was closed. As she moves to secure it, she discovers muddy footprints on the floor, signaling a break-in. Alarmed, Lucy calls for Jordan to come downstairs, but before she can respond, a robber emerges from her bathroom, overpowering and capturing Jordan. Forced downstairs, Jordan and Lucy are confronted by three menacing criminals who threaten harm unless Lucy complies with their demands. The leader of the group escorts Lucy to the safe, coercing her into opening it and placing the family's prized possessions into a bag. In the kitchen, one of the robbers warns his accomplice not to play around with a knife, compelling him to set it aside before leaving to find a rope. Taking advantage of the situation, the knife-wielding criminal preys on Jordan, only to be interrupted when his partner returns with the rope. An argument ensues as they are distracted, allowing Jordan to bravely seize the thief's knife and retaliate, slashing his face. However, her triumph is short-lived as the other robber retaliates by striking her and throwing her to the ground. Meanwhile, Lucy returns with the third criminal, witnessing the chaotic scene. Thinking quickly, she seizes a pot of boiling water and hurls it at one of the robbers' faces, instructing her daughter to flee. Unfortunately, the criminals reach their breaking point and open fire. Simultaneously, at the hospital, Paul finds himself in the midst of a critical surgery when he overhears an urgent message over the intercom regarding two incoming female patients. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Paul allows his colleague to conclude the ongoing surgery and rushes to offer his assistance. However, the other doctors prevent him from intervening in this particular case. By the time they eventually explain the situation to Paul, Lucy has already tragically lost her life, and Jordan is undergoing emergency surgery. Refusing to believe the devastating news, Paul seeks confirmation by checking on Lucy's lifeless body, the sight overwhelming him with profound grief. Later on, detectives Raines and Jackson approach Paul to ask him a series of questions regarding the incident, taking note of the stolen items from the safe. Frank also arrives at the scene and confronts the police officers, expressing frustration over their perceived lack of attention to the recent crimes in the area. Paul urges Frank to remain calm. The detectives attempt to reassure Paul that they are committed to apprehending the culprits. In the midst of their conversation, a nurse interrupts with news that Jordan has emerged from surgery alive but is now in a coma. Paul remains steadfastly by her side. In due time, Lucy's father, Ben, delivers a eulogy at her funeral. On their journey back from the service, Ben abruptly halts the car in the middle of the road, fixating on something on the ground. Overwhelmed with anger, he quickly returns to the vehicle and speeds off towards his property, where he discovers two poachers who promptly flee. Ben pursues them, firing his weapon, but the trespassers manage to evade capture. Paul is in a state of shock, yet Ben asserts his lack of faith in law enforcement, believing that sometimes men must take matters into their own hands, and proceeds to put the injured deer out of its misery. Sometime later, Paul receives a call from Detective Raines, only to be disheartened by the lack of leads or suspects in the case. His frustration manifests when he unleashes his anger on a homeless man attempting to clean his car window. After that, he goes to see Jordan and finds comfort in the fact that her girlfriend is there reading to her. Paul is grateful that his daughter has the support she needs. As the days unfold, Paul seeks therapy to help cope with his overwhelming emotions. During his sessions, he expresses his difficulty sleeping in his bed, resorting to the couch instead. Memories resurface of his troubled childhood, wherein he would ride trains alone to escape his father. Reflecting on his current circumstances, he finds himself adopting a similar pattern of solitary train rides for contemplation. Every suspicious individual he encounters on the streets triggers memories of the men who took his wife, intensifying his feelings of guilt for failing to protect his family. The therapist assures Paul that healing is a gradual process, emphasizing the need for time. Paul's days revolve around reading to Jordan, embarking on train rides, and attempting to spend time with Frank, although he primarily succumbs to his depressed state on the couch. Slowly, he develops a newfound understanding and extends some money to the homeless person cleaning his car windows. Weeks pass, and Paul still receives no updates on the case, prompting him to visit Raines personally. He asks the detective about the DNA samples, but they yield no matches in the database. A board in Raines' office displays multiple open cases, with only a small fraction resolved, exposing the limited resources available for comprehensive investigation. Later in the evening, as Paul exits the train station, he witnesses two men harassing a young woman. He intervenes, demanding that they cease their harassment. In response, the men turn their anger on Paul and beat him up. Fortunately, the young woman manages to escape. Upon returning home, Paul finds solace in watching television, stumbling upon an advertisement for a local firearms retailer, which leaves a lasting impression on him. The following day, he visits the retailer, where the shop assistant showcases an array of firearms. However, Paul discovers that he must complete extensive paperwork, undergo a gun safety class, and contend with surveillance cameras scattered throughout the establishment, leading him to express his intention to consider the decision further. Some time later, Paul finds himself at the hospital, tending to another gunshot victim. During the transfer of the patient for surgery, a gun falls from the pocket, prompting Paul to discreetly kick it under the operating table, planning to retrieve it later and concealing it on his person. Once home, Paul attempts to shoot the gun for the first time, only to have the bullet ricochet, making him realize he needs to acquire more knowledge and skills. Over the following days, Paul dedicates all his free time to watching gun tutorials, learning proper handling techniques, and practicing relentlessly until his aim improves to a satisfactory level. The following day, Paul receives a distressing call from the ICU, informing him that Jordan has experienced a seizure. As her condition worsens, the chances of her survival diminish. Observing how her body is restrained on the bed for safety, Paul becomes overwhelmed with rage, realizing that his daughter is handcuffed while the criminals responsible for her suffering roam free. Driven to the edge of his sanity, Paul decides to take matters into his own hands, waiting until nighttime to retrieve the gun. Disguised with a hoodie to hide his identity, he navigates through the dangerous streets of Chicago. Spotting two men attempting to steal a woman's car, Paul confronts them, only to have the assailants shoot at him. Rolling to evade the bullets, the criminals flee in their car, but Paul quickly recovers and manages to shoot the driver, causing them to crash. In the chaos, a shard of glass injures Paul's hand. The other criminal emerges from the wreckage, firing wildly. Paul seeks cover behind a nearby vehicle, patiently awaiting the opportune moment to aim for a fatal shot. Unbeknownst to him, a woman at a nearby window films the entire encounter. After firing a second shot, and instructing the woman to flee, Paul watches the dying driver's last breath before leaving the scene, discarding his hoodie in a nearby trash bin, and discreetly boarding a train. Once home, he employs his medical knowledge to tend to his own wound before finally falling asleep. Despite still experiencing haunting dreams of his actions, the prescribed medication from his therapist assists him in achieving a more peaceful rest. Shortly thereafter, detectives Raines and Jackson arrive to collect statements. The woman whose car was almost stolen expresses immense gratitude, while the witness who filmed the incident perceives Paul's actions as cold and brutal. Unfortunately, Paul's face remains concealed in the video, although the woman has already posted it online. The detectives watch the footage, noting the shooter's wounded hand. The following morning, Paul comes across the video of himself and finds himself impressed by his own deeds, causing the guilt that had plagued him to dissipate. The video rapidly goes viral, and the media begins debating the moral implications of his actions, as he both saved a life and assumed the role of a vigilante. Consequently, he earns the name, the Grim Reaper. At the hospital, Paul camouflages his injured hand with bandages to make it appear smaller, discreetly tucking it into his pocket whenever police officers pass by. In the afternoon, he extends his compassion to a young boy who fell victim to a shooting perpetrated by a local criminal. By exhibiting kindness and empathy, Paul manages to coax the boy into revealing that he was shot by a notorious dealer known as the Ice Cream Man, and gets the boy's address from the medical chart. After completing his work, Paul stealthily acquires a hoodie from the hospital's laundry and ventures into the boy's shady neighborhood, where he spots the Ice Cream Man casually hanging out on the street. Wasting no time, Paul swiftly shoots the criminal before making a hasty escape, prompting the locals to seize the opportunity and steal everything from his cart. Shortly thereafter, the detectives arrive at the scene and once again hear accounts of a hooded figure. Detective Rains observes a group of children reenacting the shooting, noticing that the boy is using his left hand. Drawing a connection to the viral video, Rains concludes that this could very well be the same individual known as the Grim Reaper. Meanwhile, the media erupts with frenzy over the Grim Reaper's latest attack, while Paul watches the news with a sense of pride. At the police station, the chief is angry with the detectives for allowing a vigilante to roam free and exact justice upon criminals, concerned that such actions might incite copycat behavior. However, the only leads available to the detectives are that the shooter is left-handed and lacks proficiency in handling firearms. Concurrently, Paul attends another therapy session, receiving compliments from the therapist on his improved state and urging him to continue with whatever he's been doing. Some days later, Paul finds himself operating on another gunshot victim, only to be shocked when he discovers that it is Miguel, recognizing his own watch on the patient's wrist. Lacking enthusiasm, Paul's attempts to save Miguel's life prove unsuccessful, as he dies on the operating table. Seizing the opportunity, Paul ventures to the ambulance and steals Miguel's phone, using the deceased man's cold finger to unlock it. After taking his watch back as well, Paul retreats to his office, scrolling through Miguel's phone. Paul uncovers an image of a liquor store, a front for trading stolen goods. Despite briefly contemplating contacting the detectives, Paul ultimately decides to undertake the investigation himself. When Frank pays him a visit, Paul cancels his plans, diverting his brother's attention away from the wound on his hand. As evening descends, Paul retrieves yet another hoodie from the hospital's laundry and proceeds to the liquor store. There, he fabricates a tale about being a friend of Miguel's, but the store owner, noticing the hospital label on the hoodie, discreetly sends a text to an accomplice named Fish, summoning him for assistance. Sensing imminent danger, the owner reaches for a revolver. However, Paul catches this movement in the mirror and swiftly impales the man's hand with a dart, compelling him to reveal the location of the stolen goods. At gunpoint, the owner leads Paul to a hidden safe at the back of the store, where Paul discovers his own stolen valuables. In that moment, Fish arrives and attempts to shoot Paul, but Paul, monitoring the security cameras, evades the gunfire, resulting in the bullet inadvertently claiming the owner's life. In a wild frenzy, Fish unleashes a hail of bullets, forcing Paul to seek cover and reload his weapon. Capitalizing on a fortunate moment when Fish slips on the pooling blood, Paul seizes a guitar and strikes Fish with it before toppling furniture onto the floor. Fish narrowly evades the attack and flees back to the bar, prompting Paul to utilize the security cameras to shoot Fish in the leg, causing him to collapse. Standing on Fish's injured leg, Paul interrogates him about Lucy's murderer, and Fish reveals the culprit to be a mechanic named Joe, disclosing that his address is stored on his phone. As Paul retrieves the phone, Fish retaliates by kicking him to the ground, inadvertently causing a shelf to collapse. As Fish rises to his feet, preparing to aim his gun at Paul, a bowling ball plummets from the fallen shelf, striking Fish on the head and incapacitating him. Seizing the opportunity, Paul uses Fish's own firearm to deliver a fatal shot. Paul retrieves the security hard drives and departs, inadvertently dropping his ring on the ground as he exits. Upon returning home, he watches a video guide on how to destroy the hard drives using a drill. The following day, the media frenzy surrounding the Grim Reaper escalates to even greater heights, causing anyone who has encountered him to become viral sensations. Seizing an opportunity at the hospital, Paul discreetly steals syringes and medicine, only to be unexpectedly visited by detectives Rains and Jackson. They present him with a photograph of Fish and his ring, which Paul confirms as his own. The detectives speculate that the ring had been stolen and inform Paul of this breakthrough, signifying progress in the case. Once the detectives depart, Paul proceeds to destroy Fish's phone. Later, Paul sets out to confront Joe. Skillfully maneuvering into the shop while Joe is occupied beneath a car, Paul catches him off guard, rendering him unconscious with a well-placed blow from a wrench. Upon Joe's revival, he finds himself bound beneath the vehicle, subjected to Paul's merciless interrogation tactics designed to extract vital information. Administering an injection and inflicting a deep cut, Paul exacerbates Joe's agony by pouring brake fluid on the wound. After enduring immense suffering, Joe divulges that the individual responsible for Lucy's death goes by the name Knox, but it is a matter of waiting for him to make a move rather than seeking him out directly. Expressing gratitude for the information, Paul releases Joe. But as he departs, Paul yanks a chain, causing the car to crash down on Joe, killing him instantly. Subsequently, the detectives pay a visit to Frank, realizing that all the individuals targeted by the Grim Reaper are connected to Lucy's murder. Eager to examine Frank's hand for potential clues, they initiate their inquiry. Meanwhile, Paul finds himself at the hospital visiting Jordan when he learns from the news that copycats have already emerged, perpetrating killings under the guise of the Grim Reaper's story. At that moment, Paul receives a phone call from Knox, who summons him to a club within 30 minutes. Meanwhile, Frank heads to Paul's home, where he enters after receiving no response at the door. Descending into the basement, Frank is confronted with an arsenal of ammunition and evidence depicting Paul's desolate existence, ultimately realizing that his own brother is the infamous Grim Reaper. Amidst the crowded ambience of the club, Paul communicates with Knox, informing him of his presence. Instructed to meet in the restroom, Paul navigates his way through the crowd, dialing Knox's phone along the way. Kicking open a stall, Paul discovers only a phone, but in that moment, Knox emerges from behind, employing an innocent civilian as a shield. Unleashing a hail of bullets without regard for the consequences, Knox indiscriminately kills random people. Paul sustains injuries but manages to seek refuge in a stall, returning fire and inflicting harm upon Knox. Paul shoots the power box, plunging the club into darkness, capitalizing on the ensuing panic to elude capture. Shortly after, the detectives receive a distressing call regarding the club shooting, prompting them to rush to the hospital where one of the victims, who turns out to be Knox, provides intricate details, leading the detectives to suspect Paul's involvement. However, upon arriving at Paul's office, they find it empty. Meanwhile, Paul hides within another hospital room, tending to his latest wound using glue and a stapler, enduring excruciating pain in the process. Returning home, Paul discovers Frank waiting for him, ready to confront him about his descent into madness. In defense of his actions, Paul asserts that he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands when nobody else would. Their conversation abruptly halts when the detectives ring the doorbell, prompting Frank to answer and deceive them by claiming that Paul's not home. Though skeptical, the detectives are unable to proceed without a warrant and reluctantly depart. In the midst of this, Paul receives a crucial call from the hospital, informing him that Jordan has awakened from her coma. Rushing to the hospital, Paul experiences a heartfelt reunion with his daughter, only to deliver the devastating news of her mother's death, pushing Jordan into a state of emotional breakdown. Now that Jordan's condition has improved, Paul makes a promise to Frank that he will cease his vigilante activities. As a week elapses, Jordan is finally granted permission to return home. Subsequently, the detectives arrive to question her about the night of the attack, but Jordan informs them that she doesn't remember anything. As Jordan and Paul enter the elevator, Knox joins them, causing Paul to deliberately ignore his presence for the sake of safety. Engaging in small talk with Jordan, Knox bids them farewell, leaving Paul to interpret it as a veiled threat. This prompts Paul to revisit the gun store, legally procuring a selection of weapons. Later in the evening, after dinner, as Jordan prepares for bed, Paul detects a suspicious presence outside and urgently instructs her to seek shelter under the stairs while dialing 911. In that very moment, an intruder enters through the back door, advancing towards Paul's room and aiming at what appears to be a figure on the bed, only to realize it is merely a set of pillows. Another accomplice, drawn by the sound of running water, falls into a trap as Paul eliminates him with a precise shot to the head. When the initial assailant investigates the commotion, Paul lies in wait beside the lifeless body, swiftly firing once more, causing the intruder to tumble to the first floor. Sensing activity in the basement, Paul descends, only to be caught off guard as Knox surprises him, discharging a bullet into his shoulder, causing him to collapse onto the couch. In a critical moment, Jordan emerges from the stairs, unleashing a piercing scream that momentarily distracts Knox. Capitalizing on the opportunity, Paul activates a concealed weapon concealed within his table, delivering a fatal blow to Knox. Finally, the police arrive at the scene, and Paul truthfully informs the detectives that he sustained all his injuries that night, procured his weapons legally subsequent to Jordan's recovery, and intended to use them to safeguard her from further harm. While skeptical of his words, the detectives find satisfaction in the outcome and opt to let the matter rest. Sometime later, Paul accompanies Jordan to her college in New York City, where her girlfriend eagerly awaits her arrival. As he departs to return to his car, Paul witnesses a man stealing a bag from a bellhop's cart, unable to resist calling him out while mimicking a finger gun gesture. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe for more videos.